By the turn of the millennium, Squaresoft was a brand within video gaming that almost everybody knew. They were considered to be one of the world's leading developers and sat alongside the likes of Nintendo, Sega, Capcom, Midway, and Rare. This had been achieved thanks to a string of high-profile releases across a variety of home consoles, including the Super Nintendo and the PlayStation, but this rise wasn't without struggle. Like many other Japanese publishers, even though Square had enjoyed great success throughout the 80s and 90s in their native Japan, producing numerous games that would go on to sell millions of copies, North America and Europe had always been a bridge too far. Standout games like Street Fighter II served as the exception as opposed to the rule, and Nintendo and Sega, as the home console manufacturers, utilised their extended reach to dominate the international markets alongside Western publishers like Acclaim and Virgin Interactive. To their credit, Square had attempted to break into these markets numerous times throughout this period. Operation Jumpout received a North American launch as the 3D Battles of World Runner less than 6 months after it had been released in Japan, and Highway Star, which was localized at an even greater speed and released in North America and Europe as Rad Racer, would go on to post impressive international sales figures. The latter of those releases would serve as a huge surprise for Square, but it also highlighted the potential of performing well abroad. Rad Racer, by almost all accounts, had been considered a disappointment by Square upon its Japanese release, with the father of Final Fantasy, Hironobu Sakaguchi, even considering his future in the industry. It was yet another game created under his guidance that had failed to reach the expected heights, but Square hadn't banked on it resonating with international audiences. By the end of that console generation, Rad Racer had ended up shipping close to 2 million copies, with the majority of sales coming from North America and Europe. And to emphasize just how much support the game received outside of Japan, Nintendo of America even chose to include it alongside Super Mario Bros. And Tetris as part of the lineup of games featured during the 1990 Nintendo World Championships, a prominent competition that took place in that region. These were impressive feats, but there was a major issue. Even though Square were an established player when it came to Japanese video games, even chairing their own publishing arm called the Disc Original Group, which helped other developers ship their games, they did not have the necessary supply chain and logistical knowledge to operate outside of that country in an effective manner. This deficiency meant they needed to rely on Nintendo to step in and fulfill the role of publisher, something that would see them take a back seat, as Nintendo would use their know-how of the Western consumer base to ensure games that had potential were marketed in an aggressive manner to maximize sales. Years later, when games like King's Knight and Final Fantasy received North American releases, it was the same story. Nintendo would serve as publisher, absorbing the majority of the generated revenue to cover their costs and ensure they received a suitable margin. And it meant that even though the original Final Fantasy sold more copies in North America than it did in Japan, its contribution to Square's overall revenue figure was minimal by comparison. This was far from the ideal scenario, but it was not new to smaller companies like Square. At that time, they just didn't have the financial might to compete with companies like Capcom and Konami that had made their money via the arcades, and even though many could self-publish in their own country, they would need to rely on the likes of Nintendo and Sega to help with international distribution. Nintendo, especially, had also excelled at monopolizing income, making it difficult for independent publishers to compete with their own software lineups. Many survived by relying on volume or by utilizing tactics for profit maximization, such as diversifying their portfolio, increasing their retail price point, releasing games on every available system, and securing key partnerships. But ambitious companies also explored how they could improve their margin by cutting out the intermediary, and a few years after Capcom and Konami had opened up North American divisions, so too did Square. Squaresoft was launched in March of 1989 with its headquarters based in Redmond, Washington. They were still too new to have any real impact when the original Final Fantasy released, but throughout 1990, Squaresoft would start to have a significant impact on how the company operated outside of Japan. Not only did it allow them to oversee the successful release of the Saga franchise as the Final Fantasy Legends series, it allowed them to create consistent branding and gave them more confidence in producing tailor-made experiences for North American audiences, such as Rad Racer 2, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, and Secret of Evermore. The challenge was that even though they had been afforded more control, without the support of Nintendo and their aggressive marketing tactics and regional know-how, even though Square were now receiving a much higher proportion of the revenue, sales of these focused products weren't as high as had been expected. The few games that Square did choose to localize for the Super Nintendo, such as Secret of Mana, Final Fantasy VI, and Chrono Trigger, would end up gaining cult followings, but North American sales ended up being dwarfed by their domestic returns. Whereas in Japan, each of these games were platinum, selling millions and millions of copies, in North America, the best selling of the trio was Final Fantasy VI, which only managed to sell 450,000 copies. It had also been sold at a much lower price point internationally, and with there being higher overheads due to the additional logistics steps, it's approximated that the North American release of Final Fantasy VI generated less than 10% of its global revenue. In early 1996, the continued failings of their localized releases, coupled with the poor performance of the games that had been developed under the guidance of Squaresoft, led to Square closing down their North American office, as it just didn't seem worth the cost. They would still have a North American presence, having opened another subsidiary called Square LA, which was located, as the name suggested, in Los Angeles, but that office was established with the objective of producing high-end computer-generated imagery, as opposed to publishing games. Amongst the dedicated fans who had supported Square, it meant the closure of the Redmond office was horrific news. There was a belief that it would affect the Western release of upcoming video games, and with the shock announcement of Final Fantasy VII happening around the same time in Japan, this feeling was only amplified, not least because as part of the announcement, it was revealed that Square had severed ties with Nintendo, the only other company who had consistently published games developed by Square in North America. What followed was a period of uncomfortable suspense, but by the end of the year those fears had been allayed by the announcement that Sony Computer Entertainment America would be working with Square to publish all of their upcoming games outside of Japan. It was unknown at the time, but this deal would include publishing support for Bushido Blade, Saga Frontier, Tobal No. 2, Final Fantasy Tactics, and of course, Final Fantasy VII. And unlike Nintendo, who treated Square as just another commodity during their time as publishing partner, Sony were prepared to do whatever it took to make gamers aware that Squaresoft games were now on PlayStation, and that it was a pretty big deal. Even before Final Fantasy VII had been released in Japan, Sony America pulled together a comprehensive marketing plan that would allow its North American launch to far exceed the performance of previous localized efforts. It would see them aim to sell 750,000 copies of Final Fantasy VII, almost double the sales of Final Fantasy VI, but they knew there were significant obstacles standing in their way, and there were question marks as to whether that figure was realistic. Due to Square's long-standing relationship with Nintendo, they knew that potential consumers would need to be convinced on 3 fronts. 1, that Final Fantasy VII was a game that would be worth their time. 2, that if they had not already been tempted to dive into the next generation of console gaming, the release of Final Fantasy VII was the time to do it. And 3, that their next generation console of choice would need to be the PlayStation. To work towards this goal, Sony knew they would need to go beyond just creating demand. Instead, they would need to work as hard as they could to make Final Fantasy VII the one game in the bustling lineup of upcoming video games that would be the killer app and the most desirable product irrespective of platform. This will be achieved by running an almost year-long campaign. It would have the primary objective of targeting RPG enthusiasts who were either still invested in the 16-bit era of consoles, had already purchased a 32-bit console, or had just fallen out of love with the genre. The secondary objective was then attracting gamers who were previously uninterested in the genre due to its perceived complexity and slow pacing. As a statement of intent, in January 1997, Square sent a small group of journalists from the enthusiast and consumer press over to Japan. They wanted them to be there to experience the launch of Final Fantasy VII in that region, so that they could understand how important the game was, while also giving them a chance to speak to the development team and play the Japanese version of the game. The result was clear. Coverage was secured across a broad selection of publications from the likes of Reuters through to extensive spreads in the likes of GameFan, Next Generation Online, GamePro, and what back then was known as Video Game Spot. This would then be complemented by a huge range of promotional activities that would take place in conjunction with prominent retailers around the country. Best Buy, for example, would have oversized signage featured in their stores with special shelves dedicated to Final Fantasy VII. They would also have exclusive giveaways such as a Final Fantasy VII phone card, and this would grant 5 minutes of prepaid long-distance calls, as well as 5 minutes prepaid on Sony's hint line in case consumers got stuck when playing the game. But that wasn't all. Wanting to achieve maximum exposure, Sony launched a huge TV marketing campaign that would see space bought on cable, network, and syndicated programming. This was done in conjunction with print advertising and national promotions, including a huge collaboration with Pepsi and smaller collaborations with MTV and Blockbuster. It was a mammoth undertaking with no expense spared. And by the end of the campaign, it's estimated that Sony had spent tens of millions of dollars marketing Final Fantasy VII, with some estimates placing the figure closer to the $100 million mark. As launch approached, it was clear that the investment had been worth it, as the initial objective had been achieved. Fans across the country were excited to experience Final Fantasy VII, and Sony had succeeded in convincing fans that the impressive visuals and cinematic qualities could only be experienced on the PlayStation. To emphasize the success of the campaign, after just 3 months, the hype generated was significant. Next Generation Online polled their user base about the game they desired more than anything else. 26% said Final Fantasy VII. This was a huge proportion considering this included every single possible upcoming release and included the likes of StarCraft, Resident Evil 2, Virtua Fighter 3 and X-Wing vs TIE Fighter. The impact on launch was beyond what Sony could have then hoped for. 330,000 copies were sold at launch, with the number increasing to 500,000 copies within its first month on sale. By early December, that target that had seemed unrealistic was surpassed as over 1 million copies had been shipped, and through word of mouth and being backed up by impressive reviews from critics, sales did not slow down. Final Fantasy VII would end up selling over 3 million copies in North America on the PlayStation, and such was its impact that it has been credited with not just putting role-playing games on the map, but introducing a whole new generation of gamers around the world to the qualities of Square, ensuring that their games will continue to be localized with increasing frequency and cementing their legacy as a global development and publishing powerhouse. And that is how Square, with a significant amount of help from Sony, conquered North America. It's crazy to think about how much the gaming landscape changed when Final Fantasy VII released back then, but we'd love to hear from any of you who remember playing it on the PlayStation and the emotions you felt. Likewise, we'd also love to hear from those of you who played later down the line. If you enjoyed this video and trip down memory lane, please do consider giving us a like, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more Final Fantasy content. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Anthony Hoffman, Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Erica C. Delroet, and Gregory, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.